Anyway, to introduce Steve Westlake, he is based at the University of Bath in the UK. He lectures on environmental psychology and leadership, which is the topic for today. He's an affiliate of the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformation, so CAST, and the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research. Previously, he also worked for the UK's CCC. Then there's an interesting background to him, really interesting career path. As a teenager, he was a member of Greenpeace. Then he worked after university as a computer analyst for Shell before becoming a motorcycle journalist and working at Honda in MotoGP, and then writing for fitness and cycling magazines. I think across all of that, he describes his career path as one that's allowed him to inform his research on the psychology of low carbon behaviors. So his research explores the effect of politicians and celebrities and business leaders who what we sort of call walk the talk with low carbon behaviors like flying less, eating less meat, driving EVs, improving their energy efficiency at home. And what's more, I think it's really interesting. He actually himself walks the talk. We know from my colleague Selina, who's also in the Bessie Environmental Group, that he recently travelled by train from his home in a small corner of the UK all the way to Prague for a conference, stopping off in Berlin to have a meeting with Selina. Those of you who do try to travel by train will know that this is no small feat, both in terms of time and money. So with that, over to Steve for his talk.
Yeah, thanks very much for the introduction, Liz. And it's really great to be here. Thanks, Lisa Maria, as well, for a brilliant talk. I'm looking forward to hearing more about that. Um, yeah, I could talk a lot about the trajectory that Liz described and the sort of decisions, if you call them, though, if you call them decisions, to go from being quite environmental to working for Shell and doing stuff which flying a huge amount for some of those jobs. And some of that informs the my kind of interpretation and analysis of decision making processes, and particularly kind of leadership and the signals we get from others, particularly people we respect or people who have particular, say, status, and the signals that their behavior might send about what's appropriate. So that's kind of partly why I'm really interested in this subject. So, yeah, I'll talk about my research on leading by example. It also overlaps somewhat with Lisa Maria's research on politicians, because I've done a couple of sets of interviews with UK politicians about their um, engagement with climate change in general and also about behavior change specifically. So, just a couple of quick quotations from people. I don't know if anyone wants to guess who said this. This is about a kind of a presentation of leaders. So who might have said this? You can drop it in the chat. I won't spend too long on this, but if anyone has an idea about who might have said this quote, I'm just trying to see the chat. I'm not sure if anyone said it, but I'll put you and myself out of your misery.
We've had Greta Thunberg,
Okay,
UNSG. They're the
okay.
couple of suggestions.
Yeah, good guess. Good guess for Greta. I can't see the chat, unfortunately. Sorry about that. But that was David Attenborough who said that. And it's quite a sort of old school, perhaps, version of leadership. Leaders have the power to change the world, in effect. And obviously, he's speaking to world leaders. Um, this one, obviously, you might be tempted to put the same answer, whoever said Greta, because that was Greta. I'm sure perhaps many of you kind of recognize that quote. And the reason I put this up is because there's a very strong focus on action. And obviously, Greta was well known for taking that boat across the Atlantic and acting as if there was a crisis. And so the focus is kind of consistent action with a crisis. Um, and that is kind of quite a different framing to David Attenborough's. And I've put one more quote up. I've rather ruined the surprise here because there's the video in the bottom which actually gives you the answer. So this was Taylor Swift. And the reason I put this up Obviously, Taylor Swift doesn't set herself up as a climate leader in the way that perhaps you might think David Attenborough and Greta are. And this is one of the few quotes that mentions climate change that Taylor Swift has made. So listing climate change as one of the many issues that are going to be concerning for young people. And the reason I sort of focus on Taylor Swift, obviously massively influential and famous, and potentially if she sent signals and became, say, a strong advocate on climate change, potentially could have a strong effect um, with her fans and perhaps even more broadly. So yeah, that was Taylor Swift. And I'm just going to give an example, asking the question, does it matter what politicians do personally? Does their behavior matter? This is a UK politician, Ed Miliband, probably many examples of similar incidences in the media around the world where he was advocating for an electric car revolution, saying the government weren't doing enough. He was in opposition at the time. And so he spent about 3 minutes really passionately talking about electric cars and how we need to move to electric cars. This was in 2021. And perhaps predictably, after this strong, passionate argument for electric cars, the interviewer said, "We presume you've got one." He says, "I haven't got one yet. It's a work in progress." The interviewers throw up their hands and say, "What? Practice what you preach, lead by example, etc." So it seemed like quite a typical gotcha, but actually the sort of discussion afterwards, or the way they presented to him the arguments why wasn't he leading by example, were actually quite sophisticated and did come up with quite a few um, arg- uh, sort of arguments from the literature about what leadership is. So it's showing the way, it's going first, it's setting a direction of travel. So it wasn't just a rather crude gotcha, even though that was seemed to be the effect, and the Mail Online picked that up, obviously. So it kind of raises the question: does it really matter if leaders walk the talk or not? And just one more example, Katy Perry, quite recently, this was 2025, obviously took that space flight, and there was a lot of sort of narratives around the planet and protecting the Earth whilst also doing quite a high carbon activity. So my research looks at whether the signals sent by leaders, people in the public eye, cultural leaders, business leaders, politicians, and even scientists. We got scientists there who the study showed that climate scientists tend to fly more than other scientists. Um, whether this sort of behavior matters. So the thing I'm trying to test is if we see leaders doing this, what does it, what influence does it have on us? Do we think we should take action? Do we think other people are taking action? So tapping into some of the ideas that Lisa Maria was talking about. What do we think other people believe if our leaders are doing this? And are the leaders credible? And is climate change serious if they're doing this? And so, just to set a bit more context, this idea of pluralistic ignorance again chimes quite strongly with what Lisa Maria was saying about a perception gap. So, this was a study from 2024. And essentially, one of the main messages was that we quite dramatically underestimate how concerned other people are. So we might think we're concerned about climate change quite a lot, but we don't think other people are that concerned. And that gap on average across 125 countries was a kind of 26 percentage point gap between our concern and how concerned we think other people are. And the argument is that because we think other people aren't so concerned, we're less likely to incur the burden, make the choices to tackle climate change because we feel we'd be penalizing ourselves and other people wouldn't be doing the same. So closing that pluralistic ignorance gap could be really important. And I suppose my theory of change with the research is that leaders can help to signal this by signaling their concern to some extent by their behavior. And also important context, obviously, the need to get down to an average carbon footprint much, much below where we are now. And obviously, different groups have different capacity to change and also massively different carbon footprints. So perhaps there is an onus on those in the higher bands to reduce more and perhaps reduce first. So coming to the actual studies and the results. So this was a study we published a couple of years ago, looking at leading by example from politicians and celebrities. So it was a vignette study comparing people's reactions if they see a leader who's advocating for climate action and leading by example themselves, or just advocating for climate action but not changing their behavior yet. And we came up with this idea of a missing link, that leader action is a missing link between institutions and the public, and I'll come on to that a little bit later. And so the results of that study, firstly, in terms of this appetite for leadership, essentially people really want to see leaders change their behavior if we're going to tackle climate change. So the top question is asking people if they agree that politicians, business leaders, and celebrities should set an example by making lifestyle changes first. And we can see strong agreement, 86% of people agree with that to some extent, either strongly or a little bit. I'll just move down a couple similar, just sort of the reverse wording, saying it doesn't matter what leaders do, because sometimes you do hear these arguments that it's not really important what leaders do in terms of their own personal actions. It's all about using their wider sphere of influence, which is undoubtedly important. But that's contradicted by this data. So the agreement with the personal behavior of politicians, business leaders, and celebrities is not relevant. Generally, people disagree strongly with that. So an 80% disagreement with that. And just skipping down to the lower ones, in terms of people's own self-reported impression that they could be influenced by others changing their behavior, is quite strong agreement that people think that if politicians, business leaders, and celebrities went first, I would be more willing to change my behavior. Obviously, there's questions as to how robust that is as a measure, but people tend to agree with it. Similarly, if people thought most people were changing their behavior, they'd be more willing to change theirs too. This bottom line here, people tend to agree with that. So this sort of supports this idea of if we close the pluralistic ignorance gap or the pluralistic behavior gap, then people may change faster and more willingly. And talking about willingness, we compared these two conditions of leading by example and not leading by example, and we found a small significant effect. So people simply by reading about a leader who's leading by example are more willing to change their behavior than the group who read about a leader who is not. So it just seems to send a signal of, oh, that person's doing it, I'm more willing to do it. And we suggest that this was a vignette study. In reality, that effect could be bigger. Obviously, you have to consider what is going to happen in reality rather than a study. But we say it could be bigger because the relationships with the leader would be more tangible with real leaders. And also, if multiple leaders, we just had one leader leading by example, if this was visible from many leaders representing different groups. So if there was a movement for leaders to be visibly changing their behavior, perhaps the effects could be bigger. And we sort of argue that they would be. So that was a small effect on willingness to act, but the perceptions of the leaders who were leading by example or not were very markedly different. So if you look across the bottom here, we've got cares, believes, how much people perceive the leaders care about climate change or believe it's serious. And you can see in the leading by example conditions, the left-hand bar, the blue bar, it's very positive impression of how much they care about it and believe it. If they're not leading by example, people don't think they care. And that's perhaps quite an important and perhaps intuitive result that you'd think, yeah, this signaling from their behavior indicates that they either care or they don't care. Similarly, we thought the results with how knowledgeable leaders were perceived to be. Those who were leading by example were perceived to be more knowledgeable. Now, there was no difference in knowledge in the two conditions, but they were perceived to be more knowledgeable, more warm and competent. So this idea of a sort of social affinity was closer if they were leading by example. They were perceived to be more effective leaders. Reactance against them was less, which was a perhaps talk about that later, but we expected maybe people would think they were kind of bossing us around by being too virtuous. We found the opposite effect. People preferred them if they were leading by example, and they approved more of them and were more likely to vote for the politicians. And so, just to this idea of missing link, um, we have institutions, governments, media putting out the message that we need to act urgently on climate change, or at least sometimes we have that message. And we have publics who we know are highly concerned about climate change and want to do their bit. Um, but they also want leadership. And all data repeatedly shows that the public understands that we need government leadership. We need clear leadership to tackle the climate crisis. So our contention, me and my colleagues, is that leaders' embodied response, so leading by example, can provide a missing link. So it's connecting the institutional message with the public in an everyday way. Okay, there's all these technical solutions, but what it really means, or part of what it means, is that we have to change behavior. And here we have leaders exemplifying that. So it's not saying behavior change is the only solution or indeed the most important solution, but it's a key, tangible, everyday solution that connects with people. I haven't got much longer, so I'll quickly talk about the studies with MPs. Essentially, I interviewed MPs to ask them their views on behavior change and leading by example, whether they could, whether they thought they should do it. And in essence, very simply, they said, yes, it will be nice, but we are quite reluctant to do it for all sorts of reasons. They didn't want to appear too saintly. They thought they'd annoy their constituents or various interests if they were seen to do it. It was seen as being potentially elitist because it's fine, we can afford solar panels or heat pumps. Lots of people can't. So some strong arguments saying why they were concerned about it. But ultimately, they generally said, yeah, we don't really want to be seen to be doing this too strongly. I mean, some of them do it, but they kind of do it on the quiet. This idea of being too saintly, we picked that out in the title of the paper because of the moral connotations around behavior, which are partly part of what makes it such a tricky problem. And for politicians and leaders, yeah, it's difficult ground because of the moral connotations. But that also probably gives it its or some of its power in terms of the kind of theory of change. And finally, a separate study about MPs and the difference over about 5 or 6 years from 2018, because lots happened from 2018 to 2023 or so. And essentially, we found that MPs had gone from being pretty quiet about climate change, talking about it or advocating by stealth, so trying to not really talk too much about climate change. We found that they were much more open about it, but had tended to move towards this idea of pragmatism and realism, which sounded very reasonable, but was often used and phrased in ways that promoted incremental change, not transformational change. It was used to defend fossil fuel companies within the transition and say we shouldn't try to phase out fossil fuels too fast. To protect a fragile political consensus. Obviously, that consensus in the UK, well, generally is fracturing. And it was this idea of pragmatism, realism was used to dismiss extreme, and this idea that calls for rapid climate action are extreme. We've got to be pragmatic and reasonable. So it was sort of contrasting perhaps a scientific message for rapid change with pragmatism. Yeah. And just to flag, I'm part of a new climate leadership research centre with colleagues at Oxford University, and it's trying to help leaders to move into a space where they can advocate on climate change and speak up with tools to navigate the tricky ground around, for instance, leaders tending to have higher carbon footprints and therefore being accused of hypocrisy as soon as they speak up. So yeah, that project is just getting going now. And I'll wrap up there. I'm very happy to take questions and looking forward to questions for Lisa Maria as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. And thank you again, Lisa Maria.